Welcome, I'm Carl Tape. Our topic is earthquakes in Alaska, the final in a series of background lectures needed to prepare for the series on Alaska earthquake science facts. The outline will be plate tectonics in Alaska, and then we'll look at different ways of representing earthquakes on these maps. Beach balls that show the type of faulting, dots on a map of the epicenters, colored dots of the hypocenters, blobs on a map for large earthquakes. We'll then discuss earthquakes that occurred before seismometers were there to record them. And finally, we'll look toward future earthquakes and tsunamis that might be expected in this region. I'd like to thank Leah Gardine, Michael West, and others at the Alaska Earthquake Center for providing many of the maps and images here. Here's our setup for the plate tectonic setting in Alaska of the Pacific plate shown here, subducting under the North America plate. And this setting sets us up for understanding earthquakes in Alaska. First, we have thrust faulting along the Aleutian, Alaska megathrust here. And this contact shown at depth here is responsible for, among others, the magnitude 9.2 earthquake in 1964 in the Anchorage region. We also have right lateral strike slip faulting along the Fairweather Queen Charlotte fault. Finally, we have collision of this Yakutat block into Alaska. This is a piece of thickened continental crust attached to the Pacific plate that rams into Alaska and forms the St. Elias coastal mountains. We step back to our global evidence for plate tectonics. We're reminded, if we look at the full catalog here of 19,200 earthquakes, magnitude 5.5 and greater, these help delineate the plate boundaries. It's the single most important data set for delineating these plate boundaries, as you can see here. If we look at a subset of these 19,200 earthquakes, here are the 30 earthquakes that are shallower than 50 kilometers depth and with magnitudes 8.0 and higher. We see these symbols, these 4-quadrant beach ball symbols are known as focal mechanisms, and they represent the style of faulting in an earthquake, and they're determined from seismic waves recorded by seismometers. We won't delve into how these are determined from seismic waves, but this information we can find elsewhere in some excellent instructional materials. So let's get a better idea of what these beach ball symbols are. We can think of an earthquake as slip that occurs between two blocks divided by a fault. We could imagine that this plane here represents the fault, and the earthquake, during the earthquake, slip occurs between the two faults. As we can see, these are offset. This 4-quadrant beach ball, one of these two planes that define this 4-quadrant beach ball represents the fault plane. And we can see it kind of transparent and cut away here. The slip between the two blocks would be shown by this direction here. And so this focal mechanism beach ball, it depicts the relative motion between the two blocks. We could think of these as a plate boundary, for example, or just any fault in the earth. So there are different kinds of symbols depending how the two blocks are oriented in space. The first type is strike slip faulting, and that's when we see this kind of picture, it represents that the fault planes are near vertical. And there are two possibilities suggested by this beach ball. One is left lateral faulting along this plane. The other is right lateral faulting along this plane. And one of the things is that in seismology, we can determine this mechanism, but we don't immediately know which is the fault plane. But from other information, we're often able to determine which of these two was the actual fault that broke during the earthquake. But we can get pretty close to narrow it down to two with this mechanism. Another example is called normal or dip slip focal mechanism. And this shows what the beach ball would look like. And this shows the type of motion that would be represented by the two planes, one being a steep one, shown here, with one block dropping down relative to the other. The other possibility shown here of this top block dropping down relative to the bottom one would be represented by this plane, which would be a shallower dip. We also have a thrust type focal mechanism, also known as a dip slip fault, where it's basically the opposite color. If we go back, you can see that things are kind of flipped around. Here we have one block thrust up over the other along the steep plane. And in this one, we have along the shallower plane represented here, one block thrusting up over the other. And this one is worth kind of focusing on as we go to the next stage here, because we can think of this particular fault as a megathrust, where one plate is going down under the other. And during the earthquake, the upper plate essentially rebounds back toward the trench, and we have this upper plate thrust up over the lower plate. Finally, we can have a mix of these motions, so you can have oblique focal mechanism, but we can focus on the three main categories prior to this. So back to this picture of magnitude 8 earthquakes, shallower than 50 kilometers. What we see is there are four kind of categories of possible events that we see here. So let's walk through these. First, we have that all of these are either on or near the plate boundaries, if we look at the occurrence of where these large earthquakes are. Second, most of them are on the shallow megathrust, and we can see this style mechanism. If I go back a couple slides to here, it's this type of mechanism that suggests a shallow thrust mechanism. Here we see one, this is a 2021 magnitude 8.2 in Alaska. And we can see very similar beach balls. They're oriented different directions because the faults themselves are oriented, but the actual kind of shape of the beach ball is the same, which tells us these are all shallow thrust mechanisms. And that reminds us that most of the large earthquakes that occur on this planet are shallow earthquakes that occur along the contact of the downgoing subducting plate with the upper plate. There are a couple also within the subducting plate. It's hard to tell that, but these different types of mechanisms are within the plate as it bends near the trench. And a couple are along strike slip plate boundaries down in here. But the majority are shown along these boundaries. Largest earthquakes are along the subduction megathrust. So keep in mind that this is just a 50-year or so snapshot. The previous years from this would have looked different, and so will the next 50 years, but the overall patterns and the dominance of these subduction events among the largest will prevail, but they may have beach balls, as we will see, in different spots of these plate boundaries. So this is just a snapshot of a particular 50 years or so. Let's now drop this to look at magnitudes 7.5 or higher, and we see there's a lot more earthquakes on the planet. We actually see, if we go back, we kind of start filling in. There's a lot more in this India-Eurasia collision zone, for example. But we still see mostly that these plates are, these events are occurring along the plate boundaries. Now we go into magnitude 7 or higher. We see a lot more events, a lot more beach balls, but we can still see the dominant style of thrust faulting. We see strike slip faulting here. On the Western US. And if we go down to 6.0 and higher, all of a sudden we see a lot of the plate boundaries covered. We see the spreading ridges covered with beach balls. So here are spreading ridges, which have these transformed strike slip segments associated with them. Lots of strike slip mechanisms all along here. But watch, if we go back from 7 to 6, from 7 to 6, all of a sudden, these smaller events are filling in the spreading ridges. So telling us something about the size of earthquakes that we might expect at these boundaries. Back to magnitude 7, and we're going to go north to Alaska and look at some of these events. So here we zoom in, magnitude 7 or higher. We have the Pacific plate, the North America plate, and we're going to use plate tectonics to try to understand the events that we see here. In order to do that, though, we need to step back and just remind ourselves, what are the relative plate motions and tectonic setting in Alaska? So here we have the plate motions with North America fixed, And recall that we've typically shown motions with respect to the hotspots, but in the thinking about earthquakes and mechanisms, it's probably easier to just think of, I'm on North America, the motion of North America is fixed, and let's look at the relative motion along the plate boundaries. So if we zoom in here, this is looking at fixed North America, and this shows from plate models and motion, for example, measured by GPS in some cases, you can determine the motion of the Pacific plate shown here. This is also the Juan de Fuca plate subducting under Washington and Oregon. And we see the speed of the Pacific plate and really the convergent direction and speed. So we can see what type of relative motion occurs at different parts of plate boundaries. Here, C is labeled convergent for subduction, or in this case, collision right here. SS refers to strike slip, which is occurring here, this right lateral strike slip motion. And it's a similar orientation and motion way out here in the far western Aleutians. And there's also divergent only here on the Juan de Fuca ridge where the Pacific and Juan de Fuca plate are created. We can use this information when we examine the focal mechanisms from these large earthquakes. So for example, the first category would be subduction earthquakes on the megathrust plate boundary. We can see all these very similar type of beach balls indicating the slip is occurring between the shallow dipping megathrust boundary between the Pacific plate and the overriding North America plate. The second category is a collision earthquakes on the megathrust boundary. That's represented by this earthquake in 1979, 7.4 earthquake near the St. Elias Mountains. It also looks very similar to these earthquakes, but it's a very different setting, and that it's more like collision between two continental materials rather than one plate more easily sliding and subducting under the other. So the beach balls look the same, but it's a very different earthquake and setting. The third category is earthquakes on the strike slip plate boundary. This is the Queen Charlotte Fairweather system right lateral strike slip fault. There's also kind of in dashed out here, there are also strike slip faults that occur out here. Technically, it's not quite the plate boundary, but one could argue that the plate boundary is actually where these earthquakes are shown here. So we can think of these also as strike slip faults occurring where we have strike slip type of motion between the two plates. The fourth category is earthquakes in the Pacific plate before it subducts. All of these earthquakes, 87, 88, 2018, in this particular region, the Pacific plate is deforming, and it's deforming and creating some quite large earthquakes. These are all, remember, magnitude greater than 7, in some cases almost near magnitude 8. The fifth category is earthquakes in the Pacific plate after it subducts. And we can't easily tell this from the map, but we know very well that this 2018 Anchorage earthquake is within the Pacific plate, but it's underneath the North America plate. This is just a reminder of that photo from the opening talk, showing some of the effects from this 2018 7.1 earthquake. And the last one is earthquakes in the North America plate. So this is in the crust of the North America plate, not near the plate boundary. This is the 2002 Denali Fault earthquake. This photo that we'll see in other places of the Richardson Highway offset. We can see right lateral in the sense that the highway line is to the right. If you're standing on this side, that highway moved to the right. This is a right lateral fault, and some of the slip that occurred with the pipeline, you can see the pipeline right here in the background ran about parallel, and the fault cut under the pipeline as well. So now let's step back and look at one of my favorite views of earthquakes in Alaska. Here we are looking at dots on the map, zoomed way out. Here we are looking at Alaska. We can see the plates showing up nicely from this view. So Fairbanks, or at least you are here, or at least I am here in Alaska, North America plate, Eurasia, Pacific, gives us our starting point for looking into Alaska. As we zoom in to look at a map of earthquakes in Alaska, we see, first of all, tons of earthquakes. In these views, The catalog has hundreds of thousands of earthquakes, each one with lots of recorded arrival times that analysts have looked at. It's a huge amount of work to keep track of all this information. And we're here to look at and try to understand the occurrence of earthquakes in Alaska. So one of the key points to start with is that the dots are colored. So the dots, we can call them epicenters on the map, but they occur down below the Earth's surface in almost all cases. And in some cases, they occur quite deep. So we looked at these Benioff zones, and we need to recognize larger dots means larger earthquakes. These are smaller than magnitude 4 to 6. This scale has been blown up, so these symbols don't reflect the size here. But the main point here on the depth scale was that the darker earthquakes here represent earthquakes within the subducting Pacific plate as it meets at the trench here and it goes under Alaska. We saw this earlier. So we're thinking about hypocenters, the depths of where they occur in Alaska. This shows kind of the master representation and view of Alaska earthquakes, and we'll dive into a lot of different parts of this to make sure we understand this. The first step, looking at the coloring of the dots on the map, we show here with the Benioff zones. And here it shows a cross section through the seismicity map right here. And along this cross section, we see that the dots are colored by red for the upper 30 kilometers down to 100 kilometers, 30 to 100, we see them in yellow, and then the deepest ones below 100 kilometers in the maroon. And this is the Benioff zone. So what we're seeing when we look in map view, we really want to be thinking in terms of plate tectonics. Here's the trench, the plate boundary at the surface between the Pacific and North America plate. But as we go down, here's the plate boundary. It's a very important plate boundary because this is where the 9.2 magnitude 9.2 Anchorage earthquake occurred. And within this plate is where, for example, the 2018 Anchorage earthquake occurred. So as we look into this cross section, we're reminded that there's still a plate boundary. It's below Alaska. It's a contact we can't see at the surface. The trench is the boundary at the surface way out here. Looking out in another section of the Aleutians further out west is this cross section. So this is from south to north. We see the Aleutian Trench, again, the plate boundary right about here. And then we see this Pacific plate diving down under the North America plate, much more steeply out in the Aleutians than we see under mainland Alaska. So this is the Benioff zone, and we look in map view, we need to be thinking about this picture shown here at the left, because this provides a much clearer picture of what's going on. Instead of displaying the full catalog of hundreds of thousands of events, we could look at a single year. And 2018 here was an interesting year. But the first point is that the one-year pattern of seismicity looks pretty similar to the full catalog. Each year we get kind of a similar imprint, and that's because plate tectonics is driving this process, and plate tectonics just keeps chugging along, and we get a similar pattern. Now in 2018, we saw, for example, some really exceptional and unusual things, which would be the 7.9 offshore Kodiak earthquake out here. That's within the Pacific plate before it subducts. We had the magnitude 7.1 earthquake in Anchorage. That's also within the Pacific plate, but after it has gone down, you can see the yellow depth indicating it's deeper. We had kind of run-of-the-mill magnitude 6 earthquakes along the Aleutians that we might expect each year. Then we also had an unusually far north sequence of magnitude 6.1 and 6.2 Kaktovik earthquakes in August, reminding us that significant large earthquakes can occur quite far from the plate boundaries. But stepping down, we looked at the full catalog 1 year, but you can go in, and I encourage you to go to the Alaska Earthquake Center recent earthquakes page. I just pulled this out and took a screenshot where you see fewer events, but there are only ones within the last 2 weeks. Whatever time you look at, you're looking at the last 2 weeks of earthquakes. The dominant feature is still the signature of the Benioff zone. Doesn't appear quite as clearly, but you can see these deeper, darker events. the yellow ones, the red ones, but this is the dominant feature we see. But we also see some intraplate earthquakes in mainland Alaska, all these red ones right here, and even here along the Denali Fault, not too many up for this particular time period. But we see sort of the characteristics that we would see in the global catalog. The default view would be one like this, which shows colored by the last 24 hours of the very latest, and the last 2 weeks shown in yellow. But we see a lot of big circles on here. And you can go in and click on one when you're at the web page and see more information about one particular earthquake. I'm going to skip this. This is a reminder that there's a video within the same playlist. You can learn kind of a how-to on how to explore this catalog, make cross sections, and look at it yourself. So you check out that link at the end or within the playlist. You can also click on one of these. You can click on one of these earthquakes and it'll pop up information. This is an event near Anchorage shown here. And you can click on the waveforms and actually explore the waveforms that the seismometers recorded by that earthquake. You know, within minutes of it happening, you can look at how the ground moved in particular places from that particular earthquake. Again, there's another video on how to do that at the end you can check out. And if you felt the earthquake, you should click this button and we'll be asked a series of questions about did you feel it, and it can collect information about shaking intensities or information used to infer the shaking intensity of the earthquake where you felt it. And so that's another way, and that's valuable information, especially in places where we don't have seismometers to record the kind of ground motion. So I encourage you to kind of dive in, explore earthquakes yourself, and kind of make the most of the kind of information that we have coming in real time in a place like Alaska with so many earthquakes, one every, on average, 12 minutes. Back to this earthquake map, there's another section here showing what appears to be something about the active faults in Alaska. So this blows it up, showing the active faults, Queen Charlotte Fairweather Fault. We have our megathrust, the Pacific Plate Motion, and some other labeled faults here. But we definitely see lots of earthquakes in regions of Alaska besides these faults. So the faults, it's not to say that every dot on the map comes on one of these faults. There's many faults that haven't really been identified, and we just are looking at clouds of earthquakes. A lot of discovery to be made still. And you can explore the active faults of Alaska. This is the Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys showing the different active faults that have been identified. You can go in and click on these different colored faults and just get a better understanding of the information, the type of slip, and maybe when it was last active. So you can zoom in into regions you're familiar with and just see where's the closest active faults, for example. There's a video at the end on how to do that. This is showing an image looking into southeastern Alaska and some of the complex faulting there. So back to this seismicity map, we're now getting a better appreciation for all the different kind of possibilities of what these dots are on the map. So our goal is to really look at this, or a map of a new earthquake that happens, and have a better idea of where that earthquake is most likely to be associated with in terms of a tectonic setting. So the idealistic version of plate tectonics would have earthquakes occurring only at the boundaries between the plates and within Benioff zones of subducting plates. So kind of at this boundary, this is the Benioff zone. Here's the strike slip boundary. Clearly there are earthquakes all over Alaska. Like all these red dots in here are far from the plate boundary. So we need some other explanations for why these occur. And I'll step back to the plate model, plate boundary model that we've been looking at for previously in the class. And this was Peter Bird's model, lots of plates here. When we look here in Alaska, we see these hatching marks shown here, and the Himalayas and a couple other places, but Alaska is a pretty substantial example of this. And if we look in here, here it is again, it pretty much covers all of mainland Alaska and even some of the offshore Gulf of Alaska region. And these represents regions where the motion of the earth is not behaving rigid body motion, that there's actually internal deformation. Things are kind of moving relative to each other. And that also is manifested by having earthquakes across this entire region, including in the oceanic crust out here. So already we're set up to say, you know, Alaska doesn't fit plate tectonics perfectly, but that's what makes it really interesting, is to look at what is going on in here. Here's an imaginative but published and geologically based picture. It's kind of hard to see here, but this is Alaska shown right here. This is the Aleutian Arc. This is going the Juan de Fuca Plate, Vancouver Island. So you're looking at this really no borders picture of plate tectonics, with the North America plate definitely out here, the Pacific plate definitely out here. But then these authors in between have said there's some complicated things going on. They label this NPRS, the North Pacific Rim Orogenic Stream. But the point is that things are not behaving rigidly according to these authors and some of the data that are underlying this inference or hypothesis of motion. So this is kind of a picture, and we'll look at some more sort of data substantiated versions of this. But it's good to keep in mind plate tectonics works, but in Alaska, it's really a broad zone of deformation, and we need some other explanation for what we see here, including all these earthquakes. Here's another view of this from Kaler and Carver, 2018, and this is looking at the convergence rate between Pacific and North America, and basically saying that, no, it's not occurring right across a sharp plate boundary, or not even right across the kind of downgoing contact between the Pacific and North America plate on this megathrust. It's saying, in this case, there's 50.4 millimeters per year happening between these two plates, but a lot of it's happening down here. But as you go north, even into the Brooks Range, there's small amounts of this relative motion that's happening far from the plate boundary. So I like this picture because, again, it's getting at, you know, plate tectonics is the main picture, but there's a lot of complexity out here to be understood by a lot of minor faults, earthquake occurrences, and as we'll see, basically the relative motion measured between plates. So here's a geodetic-based study of trying to understand the relative motion within Alaska and relative to North America. And the authors, Elliott and Freimuller, have cut up the Alaska into blocks. And so we could almost think of these as microplates, tiny plates, as a way to try to understand the motion that we see in these regions. So we've been talking about really two main plates in the system, North America and Pacific, but you might want to just think of these as microplates with fault boundaries, such as the Denali Fault along these, having relative motion across them. And this is showing the representation, showing the model predictions of relative motion across block bounding faults. We can see here, these are shown in millimeters per year, not very much motion, but something is needed in order to explain some of the geodetic measurements relative to North America. The Kaltag Fault, Kobuk Fault, you have the Denali Fault system here. We won't discuss this, as really the colored dots here about the locking contact between Pacific and North America. The main point is that there are faults within Alaska to explain the relative motion. We'll then look toward the last component on this map, looking toward large earthquakes. And if we look toward large earthquakes, we see this more than a dot. The largest earthquakes are represented by patches that show the full area of the fault that ruptured. And these zones are shown here for predominantly older earthquakes in Alaska. We really need to look back in time to see some of these largest earthquakes prior to the catalog we've been showing of 1976 and later, for example. And this shows the rupture patch represented here, that there's a contact between one plate going down, and the contact is shown here, kind of a large area. It's not just a dot on the map in the case of 1964, for example. And so here we see the earthquakes that occur along the megathrust plate boundary, and then also the strike slip boundary, but we'll dive into this more soon. So our categories before, looking at the dots on the map, we can see they fall into the first three: subduction earthquakes on the megathrust boundary. This applies to this cartoon here as well. We also have collision earthquakes, this one from 1979 on the megathrust plate boundary. That looks similar to this, except that on the Pacific plate, we'd have this thickened block. So it's sort of continent-continent collision in this particular region. And the third category would be earthquakes on the strike slip boundary. And it's a reminder to think about sort of the size of earthquakes, is that these take time. They occur over large spaces, as we just saw, hundreds of kilometers. It's not just a dot on the map, but they also occur over minutes. So I'll show a video here, and you can check this out for yourself with the link that's at the end. But this shows in minutes of a model for the 1964 earthquake that starts near the Prince William Sound region and kind of propagates toward Kodiak, emanating these waves, 4 minutes into the earthquake, and then these propagate outward over Alaska. But it's a good way to kind of think about the size and space and time of these events as they occur. There's also a higher resolution version, and this is showing kind of a schematic view on the side that's 1,200 by 600 kilometers. This is Anchorage and Fairbanks. And you can see this earthquake start 1 minute into the earthquake, waves reach Anchorage, but it's that the earthquake is breaking rock along the megathrust over minutes. 2 minutes into the earthquake, it's still moving down at sort of kilometers per second down toward Kodiak. And so minutes into the earthquake hasn't even finished going. So that's why you have long ground motion, in part because the earthquake itself lasts a long time. So you can explore these. They'll probably play better when you find your own links on YouTube. So these earthquakes that we saw as we look back in time, we're reminded that Alaska is this global earthquake producer. So even though we saw one beach ball from 2021 from the last 50 years, if we look at the larger recorded history of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, here they are, top 13 on the planet. And 4 of these, 1964, 1965, 57, 46, 4 out of 13 on the planet occurred in Alaska and are represented by those kind of blobs that we saw in that previous diagram. So it's a major earthquake producer, especially in the context of these subduction events. So let's look at some of the examples of the effects from these big historical earthquakes. We'll just show some highlights: 1899, 1946, Unmac, 1958, Huslia, 1958, Fairweather strike slip earthquake, landslide, mega tsunami, and 64. And these examples are all taken from the Alaska Earthquake Science Fact videos. So this is really just a preview for what we'll dive into deeper during those. This shows a photograph of an effect, a spectacular effect from the 1899 magnitude 8.1 Yakutat Bay earthquake. 14.4 meters of uplift occurred. So when you see this kind of terrace, you have to appreciate that, within a matter of minutes of the earthquake, the Earth's surface was forever changed. You can see this terrace today, over 100, 120 some years later, this terrace, the Earth permanently moved from slip on this fault. And that's the kind of thing where to relate the geology around us with something that happens in a matter of minutes is really spectacular. This shows the local effects, 8.6 earthquake and tsunami in 1946 in the Aleutian Islands. This shows a Coast Guard lighthouse, fairly strong federal government built lighthouse, really no match. This is the before and this is the after from a tsunami wave that wiped this out and tragically killed the men who were inside on watch. The wave even reached all the way up here, flooded this way up on shore. And this is caused by a tsunami that propagated across the Pacific Ocean and originated from an earthquake, from motion on the megathrust. This shows a marking tree in Hilo Harbor in Hawaii. You can see this tree with the girl standing there for scale, small girl. And you can see these marker signs on the tree. And what they are the wave heights as they came into Hilo, Hawaii of tsunamis. And if you look at the very top, way up here, at 26 feet high was the wave that came into Hilo Harbor. So this gives, just the global extent and significance of some of these Alaska earthquakes, and also caused dozens of deaths during this event in Hawaii. Here's a shot from 1958 in Huslia. These are some boards holding up that popped loose during this 7.3 earthquake, just showing the kind of structures that would be common then and even today in places in remote areas of Alaska. One of the points about Huslia is that it's very far from the plate boundary. We talked about all these little dots on the map, but when you think about, how are we getting a 7.3 magnitude earthquakes in the interior of the North America plate? This is an open question. What other parts of Alaska could host a 7.3 earthquake? This is 900 kilometers away from the plate boundary right here, where the Pacific plate goes under the North America plate. 1958 Lituya Bay earthquake and mega tsunami. This earthquake along the fair-weather strike-slip plate boundary between Pacific and North America. Pacific would be in the foreground, North America in the background. The shaking along the strike-slip fault set loose some landslide of rocks that plunged into this fjord that created a mega tsunami that wiped out all the trees. This trim line here, this is the forest of mature large trees. And this point right here at 524 meters above sea level, it's actually the highest elevation ever generated by a wave on the planet. So this destruction, no wave, as far as anyone can tell, has ever reached this high. And it's sort of an exceptional occurrence of the shape of the fjord, the shaking of the earthquake. But the main point, among others, is that there's a plate boundary between Pacific North America, and that's the kind of stuff we can look at in more detail as we study these historical events. Here's a shot from downtown Anchorage, some of the strong shaking effects we saw previously. This earthquake itself started from Prince William Sound all the way down toward Kodiak. This is just a photograph of some of the shaking that was experienced in one particular area, but is by far, this earthquake is not limited to Anchorage. It's just that this was the main cosmopolitan or urban center that experienced a lot of the destruction and damage due to man-made structures built on, in this case, soils that were prone to liquefaction. So all the earthquakes we've considered so far were recorded by seismometers that were either in Alaska or on other parts of the Earth. The instrumental era of seismology began in 1897, but what about earthquakes prior to this time period? What about earthquakes before there were even people in Alaska, for example? How do we learn about them to inform what might happen in the future? For that, we'll start with a historical synthesis about an earthquake that happened in 1788. This is Kodiak Island, and this is based on records obtained by or written by Russians who were colonizing this area. It started in 1784 in this Three Saints harbor here. And this shows an interpretation based on the information they have of tsunamis that were, in excess of 30 meters in some places, but interpretation that this earthquake ruptured a very large section of the megathrust, potentially 8.5 to even magnitude 9 based on these historical records. But you can look back farther through some innovative geological sampling of how deposits of sediment occur or how the ground moves permanently up or down during these large earthquakes. And this shows a photo. So during the few minutes of a massive earthquake, huge areas of ground can move up or down permanently. And that can change, as anyone who's been in a coastal area, if you move, whether it's the tide or the ground itself, if you move them up or down a couple meters, you're going to have a very different environment of things that are relying on certain sea level to live in that intertidal zone. And so this shows a photograph of trees that were killed when the ground dropped down in 1964. So it says 1964 trees in organic soil. So this is the layer where, due to changes in 64, which we'll see later, these trees just died on the spot. You can see these ghost forests in Girdwood and outside of Seward in southern Alaska. And then if you look deeper in the ground, it shows tree at about 870 years before present. And this is another ghost forest. So the authors are identifying materials from previous earthquakes, and it's very valuable to understand how often does a magnitude 9 happen. Well, we need to look deeper into other data sources to find that. And I'll show a couple snapshots. This is from a talk by Ian Shannon showing really just a large number of coastal areas where scientists have gone to sample into this sedimentary record and try to understand and date the materials that are left behind, these sort of exceptional layers that are thought to preserve large earthquakes. And this shows 22 different studies in the Southern Alaska region. So here's Anchorage in here, Girdwood region, Kodiak, and this is colored by the 1964 displacement of what went up and what went down. And we have an entire Alaska earthquake science fact devoted to that. The impression here is that people can go into coastal regions to understand something about past earthquakes in these regions. This shows kind of a synthesis view of tons of this work, and I'll walk through this. The segment is shown here of sort of the segment along the megathrust boundary from Kodiak to Kenai to Prince William Sound, Yakataga toward the east. So this is sort of southwest to the east. And then this is showing going back in time. And so what you see here is at 1964, they can kind of calibrate this science because we have a huge earthquake that happened during our time and era to see all of where 1964 deposits occurred. And you can get some sense of the spatial extent of the effects of most cases, it is the static, the motion that went either up or down. And that same motion generated tsunamis. So you can also have tsunami deposits, but it's probably better to think of kind of motion going up and down in combination with tsunami waves. So that shows this event. And then they say, well, here's earthquake 1, 870 years before present. And you can kind of see where that deposit shows up. And this is going back in time. And the coolest thing is, thousands of years before present, getting an idea of how often these really large earthquakes and tsunamis have occurred associated with these events. So you get how much going back in time and also how broad in space these earthquakes and deposits were. So really neat aspects. Doesn't have anything to do with seismograms and seismometers, but it's important to think about future earthquakes. And this shows one of these examples of a scenario earthquakes which provide estimates for co-seismic vertical displacement. So here I say, imagine that this kind of slip happened on the fault, then predict what the ground would go. And so red would go upwards, blue would go downwards. And you can think about these predicted displacements can be compared with observations of dated materials, in this case for earthquakes that occurred some 800 years ago. So observations from these ancient earthquakes help us determine what scenarios were possible back then, and therefore, if it happened back then, could be a possibility for the future. So whether it is this map shown here with hundreds of thousands of dots, or a map of the last 2 weeks of earthquakes, or any one particular earthquake, the question is, how can we make sense of why it happened where it did? So we'll go to these 6 categories again. As we look at this map with a new understanding, we can see, okay, subduction earthquakes on the megathrust boundary. We may need a little more information, especially for larger earthquakes, to determine these were not in the subducting plate, but along the boundary. But in general, we look at these and we can think these are subduction earthquakes along the megathrust plate boundary. We also have in this collision zone where the Yakutat block is, these would be considered potentially collision earthquakes on the megathrust plate boundary. And the third category is earthquakes along the strike slip boundary represented by the Fairweather and then Queen Charlotte right lateral strike slip fault. We then have earthquakes in the Pacific plate out here before it subducts. We have earthquakes in the Pacific plate after it subducts. That is the Benioff zone shown here by the maroon and yellow dots. Those are within the Pacific plate, but under the North America plate here. And finally, earthquakes in the North America plate. All these red dots that are within the crust of the North America plate, here's the Denali fault and aftershocks. These are really what we would call intraplate North America. And we've seen here that these occur because Alaska is not just a rigid plate that moves on the sphere, but there's a lot of internal deformation. So these are the 6 categories. When we look at an event that happens, it'd be great to try to understand which one of these it falls into. Takeaway topics: mainland Alaska is a region of broad deformation as evidenced from GPS measurements of relative motion and earthquakes that are everywhere. Our 6 categories of earthquakes in Alaska we just looked at: subduction earthquakes on the megathrust boundary, that would include the 64 magnitude 9.2 Anchorage earthquake. Collision earthquakes on the megathrust plate boundary, that included this 1979 7.4 earthquake. Earthquakes on the strike slip plate boundary, such as the 1958 Lituya Bay earthquake, landslide, mega tsunami. Earthquakes in the Pacific plate before it subducts, that would include the 2018 7.9 offshore Kodiak earthquake. Earthquakes in the Pacific plate after it subducts, that includes the 2018 7.1 Anchorage earthquake, and that photo that looks like a bowling ball dropped out of the sky onto the ground. Earthquakes in the North America plate, that include 1958 7.3 Huslia, 900 kilometers from the plate boundary, or the 2002 magnitude 7.9 Denali Fault earthquake near the pipeline. Large earthquakes such as 1964 magnitude 9.2 occur over a time period of minutes and along faults that are hundreds of kilometers in length. So it's not a dot on the map. It takes time to happen. Just to break that much of the Earth's contact at these plate boundaries. The instrumental era of seismology started in 1897. Studying earthquakes in Alaska prior to this time requires historical records or geological data collected from coastal regions subjected to vertical displacements during large earthquakes. And when the ground moves vertically up or down, you have these changes in the material, the environment, life that occurs in those settings. An earthquake focal mechanism, beach ball, depicts the type of faulting in an earthquake. This one's worth looking at some of these links and maps. A lot of these videos, these can be found in the same playlist, looking at how to interact and explore this content yourself, or watch some of these earthquake simulations.